Folks. Thanks for joining today's webinar. We're going to get going in just about a minute here, but we do really appreciate you joining us this, I guess, morning for some of you, afternoon for others, as we talk about the State of Continuing Ed 2021 research. Thank you so much. Great. Well, why don't we get started? We are right at the top of the hour here, and we have a lot of material that we want to cover today. Thank you so much for joining us for today's web event, where we're going to be reflecting on and diving into the findings from the 2021 State of Continuing Education Survey. My name is Amar Dalawalia, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Evolution, an online publication founded by Modern Campus and focused on the transforming higher ed ecosystem. For those of you who are new to our publication, The Evolution publishes articles and interviews by leaders across the higher ed space, sharing their insights into how the post-secondary space is changing and how institutions are adapting to keep pace. I'm fortunate to be joined today by Rob Westervelt, the Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at Lindenwood University, and Tom Bornhorst, the Vice President for Corporate Development, Applied Research and International Education at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. Now, a few housekeeping notes before we jump in. We're going to be leaving time at the end of today's presentation for a Q&A. So if you want to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A tab that you'll see in your control panel. We'll also be sending you a recording of this session and the slide deck tomorrow afternoon, so keep your eyes open for that. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing for the next 60 or so minutes, during the webinar today, we're going to be, as I mentioned, sharing the findings of the State of Continuing Education 2021 research that was conducted by The Evolution in partnership with Modern Campus. And we're going to reflect on the implications of these findings on our industry's direction. I'll start off by talking a little bit about the background of our annual study and explain the roots of the modern learner engagement gap that we see widening between students and the higher ed institutions that are designed to be serving them. We'll then pivot to a panel discussion with my friends Rob and Tom, and with the time we have left at the end, we'll answer any questions that you might have about this exciting but underexplored space. Now, to give you an understanding of why we conduct the State of Continuing Ed survey, we do it every year to get an inside look at the trends that are shaping the higher ed space and to understand the challenges and opportunities facing colleges and universities today. This is critical because, as folks in CE specifically know, data is not always readily available to understand this space. Continuing education is incredibly varied, incredibly diverse. There's a rich array of institutions offering a rich array of programming to a rich array of students. So first and foremost, we do the State of Continuing Ed survey to shine a light on the things that bind us together. Understanding these trends isn't just important for folks in the continuing ed space either. It's really important for everyone in higher ed. CE often lays the foundation for the rest of the industry, from micro-credentialing to online learning to concierge support. All these concepts that are becoming standard practice for main campuses today emerged in continuing education. A clear picture of what's happening in CE can help main campus leaders get an early sense of the opportunities and challenges on their horizons. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing a few key findings from this year's study, but please do visit moderncampus.com/CE21 to download the full research report. That's moderncampus.com/CE21 with a big C and a big E. One major finding from this year's study is that an engagement gap is emerging between students and the higher ed institutions that serve them. We've seen evidence of this gap in the industry-wide enrollment declines that we saw last year, despite unprecedented levels of unemployment, which, generally predicts significant enrollment growth. And frankly, this kind of comes from this engagement gap that's emerging between higher ed institutions and modern learners. The fact of the matter is that modern learners think and act like customers. Their expectations are set by daily engagements with e-commerce giants like Amazon and Uber. They're looking for a personalized experience from every engagement with every service provider, and they absolutely think of higher ed institutions as service providers. Secondly, traditional institutional structures and processes reduce students' willingness to engage. Higher ed institutions rarely build personalization into the student experience, sometimes by design, sometimes by limitations. But ultimately, it leads to the delivery of a poor customer experience for the students that they're trying to serve. And ultimately, that lack of engagement negatively impacts enrollment and retention. A study from the University of Maryland found that a student will drop out after 3 bad experiences with institutional administration, which means that the customer experience really does have a direct impact on the institutional capacity to serve its learners, its community, and its mission. That's why I'm excited to introduce you all to Modern Campus, a new player in the higher ed space with 40 combined years of experience delivering the digital engagement modern learners expect. The focus of the Modern Campus platform is to revolutionize the student experience with massively personalized digital engagement. The platform is composed of the Omni CMS, the #1 web CMS of choice for higher ed, and the only purpose-built CMS to meet the unique and important needs of students and the institutions who serve them, and Destiny One, the #1 solution to manage the business of non-traditional higher education. Now, we're going to get into the findings of this year's State of CE research, but please do visit moderncampus.com to learn about our vision for higher education's future. So we're going to start off today's session with a poll because it's good pedagogy. And we're going to give you guys about 30 seconds to share your responses. And frankly, we're fascinated by what you're going to say here. So do you have senior leadership buy-in to scale and expand non-degree education at your institution? Again, we'll give you about 10 to 15 more seconds to respond to this question. Do you have senior leadership buy-in to scale and expand non-degree education at your institution? So let's see the results if we could. So, all right, 61% of folks say they do. That's kind of interesting. So, Rob, Tom, let's kind of get the ball rolling here and then start chatting a little bit about what we're seeing there, because it's interesting. 61%. It's fewer than who answered that question positively during this year's survey. 76% of respondents to the survey said they had senior leadership support to scale and expand non-degree programs. What's fascinating is that the most common barriers to program launch really all stem from a lack of senior leadership support. We see the administrative burden from scaling non-degree education. We see the program cost, the launch cost, getting new offerings off the ground. The one that really jumps out at me, main campus acceptance and support. So let's start off at the top. Do continuing education and non-credit education leaders actually have senior institutional leadership support to scale and grow? And Rob, I'll start with you here, please.
Yeah, I thought this statistic was the most concerning in that the other things that you'll get into later seem to contradict this. I think there's buy-in from a ideological perspective. You're going to be hard pressed to find somebody who's going to say, no, I don't think we should pursue this at all. I mean, there are those who say that, but I think when we think about buy-in, what we really want to think about is budget and support and participation. So I think that's super critical. And you can see the schools that are really buying into this, right? What was it, a week or two ago, Southern New Hampshire bought Kinsey Academy, to pursue micro-credentials. That is buying. I think a lot of what we see now is just this assent to a proposition rather than actual buy-in. So it was nice to see that our group here is a little bit more realistic, but I think that the buy-in is even lower, quite frankly, than what we see.
And Tom?
Yeah, thank you. Completely agree with Rob on this. If you're not willing to allocate resources, I would argue everything else becomes rhetoric, right? Because you're not going to be able to move the needle on any of this. We just went through this, Red, as you know, right, where we actually pulled all non-credit out of the academic division, pulled the resources with it, and created a whole new structure for our non-credit. And the other part we did is we put it in our strategic plan. It is one of the 4 pillars of our 5-year strategic plan. So it really does tell you that the campus has bought into it. On that side, there's still, I think, a cultural side to this, though, where you can always see, whether it's in scheduling or talent management, where we seem to creep always towards the credit, right, as opposed to looking at our entire customer body and saying, okay, but what's best for all of us? And but that I'm finding that's changing because I always make sure my director of Con Ed goes to our dean council meetings once a month. We have our product strategists who are in the operational side of every school, right? At least once every 2 weeks. So we're really trying to weave that culture of a student is a student is a student, right? And it does take time, but I can actually see the needle moving on this, Amit, as we go along. So I'm very pleased with where we're going.
Yeah,
I want to.
one
Sorry,
thing I
Rob.
would just add to that, the real question that needs to be raised in terms of this buy-in concept is how many millions of dollars are you investing in this over the next 5 years? Like to Tom's point, it's in our strategic plan. Money's being allocated, resources are being allocated. And if we ask the question along those lines, I think the percentage would be much lower.
Well, it's the buy part of buy-in, right? It's not, I'll tell you, Tom, to your point, when you look at the ideal model for continuing education or for non-credit programming, it's so interesting to see how different institutions take different approaches, where at some schools you'll have every single faculty managing its own non-credit programming, totally separated and devoid from everyone else on campus. And it really becomes kind of a side project. There isn't a consolidated approach to delivering on it. But I guess when you think about a strategic plan from its very essence, are we doing the thing, yes or no? Then you could look at that model and say, well, yes, we tick the box, we're doing the thing. So I want to dive into this idea of what meaningful support actually looks like and means, right? Because when we see support for lifelong learning, demand for adult access, demand for programming designed for working adults or professionals, or to support lifelong learners, it can be a binary yes or no tick box, or it can be how are we meaningfully behind this? And when we see it in increasing numbers of strategic plans, we know that there's understanding for the value of this programming, but then how do we transform that emotional resonance into something that's meaningful? So how can non-degree leaders transform the broad understanding of continuing ed's mission into investment and support for their work? And Tom, I'll come back to you here because I feel like you just lived this.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. We did a entire divisional restructure during a pandemic, right? And because we basically got our restructure done in February, and we were off campus in March, right? But to go backwards, Amrit, you nailed it. For us, non-credit lived in all of our 8 schools, right? And done off the sides of the desk. So I brought in I have a business intelligence analytics group, brought them in and started doing some really hard data looks at what was going on. And we just found that the focus just wasn't there, right? So when we talk about the leader of Con Ed, I think you have to step up that one higher, right? Does the executive management committee or cabinet, whichever you wish to call it, buy into it? Because if not, it's gonna be an uphill battle, right? So they did buy into the idea of pulling credit and non-credit apart, and we actually made some hard decisions. We created a whole operational group for our non-credit side, and we wound up having everybody interviewed for the positions from the academic division, and we didn't need all of them. And we knew that because we wanted to reallocate some of that of those resources into our marketing side, into our product development side. But again, very methodical, right, as we went through it. What I am finding is, because the way we set it up, we actually have product strategists. So very much like a company would do, right? And then we have our whole advising group as well, which, call it your customer service group, but completely dialed in now on our non-credit. Backed up by really strong data that's being produced by our business and intelligence and analytics group. So I can feel it over this last year, even with us being remote, there is a lot of momentum, because our goal, and I'm going to go back to something that Rob said, our goal is to double our revenue in the next 5 years. You can't do that by investing $100,000, because now you're talking $10, $15 million, right? So this does take a lot of resources to do, right? It can't be done on the cheap, because it's not going to work.
Rob, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Tom said it all. It is about resource and commitment in true buy-in. Like you said, Amrit, it's about the buying part. And it's really looking into the future and saying, is there going to be more of this in the future or less of this in the future? I think what this statistic does show is there is a general belief there will be more of this in the future. So if you really believe that, you want to start acting like that future is actually going to happen, and that requires that investment.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting actually you say that. That's highlighting areas for opportunity or for growth. Survey respondents overwhelmingly pointed to micro-credentials and stackable credentials as the main drivers of what they think the future of higher education is going to look like. Now, we're going to get into supporting that and resourcing that further down the road. But I'm curious as to, when you start proposing major programmatic changes, it requires some level of I guess, active participation from colleagues across main campus, right? It can't just be continuing education working in a bubble. We've tried that. It has, there are positives and negatives to that approach. And again, when we talk about some of the gaps, the roadblocks, the hurdles to scale, some respondents highlighted this lack of faculty understanding and fears of enrollment cannibalization and even internal competition as an obstacle to their success. Now, let's take a moment to talk about this idea of enrollment cannibalization, actually, before we really get into the next question about sort of the strategic imperative of continuing ed. Can we take a minute to dispel the notion that such a thing exists as enrollment cannibalization? Rob, I know you're champing at the bit here.
Oh, I mean, I understand the fear of cannibalization, but it's very connected to the fear of the disruption that's going on within higher education itself. But if you look at all great organizations, they confront cannibalization by cannibalizing themselves. Steve Jobs has that famous quote about, "We've got to cannibalize ourselves or else somebody else will." But in this particular case, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. And as we move more to a learner-centric perspective, which is true lifelong learning, I think some of the people who are on the I'm afraid of cannibalization side haven't really bought into the concept of lifelong learning yet. And so that, I think, helps people to move forward to see these things a little bit differently in terms of, we're not just looking at students from an episodic perspective of 4 to 6 years, we're looking at them from a lifelong perspective. And we have to build the infrastructure to do that. That's one of the things we're doing at Lindenwood is we have to build a micro-credential infrastructure. That takes time, resources. It has to be an initiative. We have to create structure around it. But it's not to say that we're going to get rid of our traditional side. In fact, we're going to grow that too. But those traditional students are going to need these non-degree pathways going forward. So if we really care about them, we need to structure ourselves around their needs.
Tom?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with Rob. It is interesting because I think one of the misnomers is people think the customers in non-credit are the exact same customers as in credit, right? So we dispelled that very quickly by, again, having our analytics team really dig into it. And we found actually as a whole, they were very distinct markets for us, right? Our Con Ed non-credit side was really people who were already in careers. A lot of them already had a credential. What they were looking for was building skills, right? So that they could change careers, or, it might be where their employer says, okay, I need you to take this course. So they could just come in. And to Rob's idea, we talk a lot about that lifelong learning. And what does that pathway look like? We're actually in our journey right now of how do we involve our alumni a lot more in our lifelong learning process? Because I think that's one opportunity that most schools miss dramatically. We tend to a lot of times focus on the fundraising side for our alumni, right? And not necessarily the value added side for our alumni. And I'll give you a really quick anecdote. We had an industry partner who gave us $250,000 to do to provide scholarships because we just had our 250,000th alumni graduate. We actually went to our government and they matched the fund. We had about 800 people register within, I think it was 21 days, and it was done. So it just tells you there's the appetite is absolutely there for this. So again, I'm not a big buy-in of cannibalization. I agree with Rob. I think if that's what you're afraid of, other people will do it for you instead. right? So I think you have to have that confidence of growing your pie as opposed to, you know, robbing from here to pay here. It's not the right way to look at this. This has to be about growth. It can't be about status quo.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like Google really cares a whole lot about what we're doing, do they?
No.
Right? They're just going to serve the need that's out there, and that's really what we need to do as universities and colleges. Is we need to serve the need, and just-in-time learning is a huge need, and it's only getting bigger, not smaller.
Yeah. And so I'm just going to jump in on one more thing when you talk about product development. One of the things I always challenge every time somebody brings one up, I said, do we buy it or do we build it? Right? Because I think too many times we think we have to build everything, right? And content, there's a lot of content in this world. Going to Rob said about Google, LinkedIn. I mean, we could just keep going through that, right? The other side we brought in a software that basically scrapes employee websites to see what employees are looking for, right? In terms of positions, in terms of skills, etc. So part of our micro credential is actually being built upon this data of real-time data that's coming from our region to really understand what skills, whether it's hard skills, soft skills, that companies are actually looking for. So we very much see industry as a fundamental customer in order to drive our content.
Sure. I mean, being able to map out career pathways for learners and going the step further than that, of being able to market programming on the backs of the career pathways that could be designed by a particular program, or the opportunities that exist for an individual on the back of a particular certificate or a particular course or a particular degree program, and being able to share that information with students, that's a huge contributor to closing the learner engagement gap. I promise we're going to get to the question about CE as a strategic imperative, but I have one stat to share with you guys that doesn't come from the state of CE. 58% of students, of incoming freshman students in degree programs, say that they're enrolling to achieve career outcomes or to achieve career objectives. But 2 out of 5 bachelor's degree holders are underemployed in their first role. So what that tells us about the need to find ways to embed professional education, skills training, clarity around career directions and career pathways at every level of even our traditional learner engagement is startling. It's staggering because it shows us that we have a lot of work to do. And I think it shows us that we have a lot of opportunity to engage not just our alumni in continuing education, which frankly we're not doing a great job of, but it shows us that we have an opportunity to engage our traditional degree-seeking students with continuing education before they even graduate, to give them opportunities to build those professional skills, to build that workforce orientation before they ever even leave us.
Well, and one thing that I think is a huge opportunity along these lines is I'm hearing more and more from CEOs that they're like, you can come work for us without a college degree, but you do need some specific training to get in. And then as you go up, you need a college degree. So one of the opportunities here is creating these pathways for employers through co-created credentialing programs, and then carrying them through their organization as they head up the ranks and they need that degree. There's just all kinds of opportunity in this space, but if you don't have that capability, you don't get to play in that space.
Yeah. So let's get to this question about the strategic imperative of continuing ed, because we got a question that specifically relates to this that I'm happy we can answer at the same time. You know, I'll read the question out. Some of us are auxiliaries and can't get support. What advice would you share? And I think this intersects with something we wanted to talk about anyway, which is the fact that many institutions see their continuing ed divisions as peripheral side hustles. Go generate revenue, thank you very much. But what we're talking about here is a fundamental repositioning of continuing education as a strategic imperative for the future of the institution. So let's take about 5 minutes and talk about how do we address this gap between where continuing education is perceived to be and where it is. And Tom, I think I'll come to you to start here, please.
Sure. It's a great question, right? Because the term auxiliary itself is quite the statement, right? Because it does say that it probably is not part of the strategic imperative of the institute. I agree. You know, going back to even what Rob said last time, that whole idea of the intersection of the two and the value added that it was going to give, not just to your non-credit, but to your credit students. I think that whole industry engagement is absolutely essential, right, in this whole area, because again, it will help all students. It's not just going to help non-credit students. And that's, I think, the paradigm shift that needs to start happening is we see this too much as separate all the time, separate entities. We need to lift it up to the institution again level and say what is right for our students and what is right for the institution itself. So I think that's where you wind up getting a lot more buy-in, when you can show that connectivity between the two.
Rob?
Yeah, I think one of the big opportunities in this space is to be sort of the innovation space within the institution. A lot of institutions don't have any space to create change. The unique space with CE is that it's all about change. They're very entrepreneurial. They have different paradigms, especially with non-degree. You don't have the constrictions that you normally do in a degree-based environment. So this is really an opportunity for universities to think more innovatively about this and create, sort of even repurpose CE as sort of their innovation incubator. Because like whenever you're in a disruptive environment like ours, you can't plan your way forward. You have to design your way forward because you don't know what you don't know, but you also have to experiment, fast fail, iterate, and do all of that. And at Lindenwood, we use what's called the dual operating system, you know, that Cotter design, where you have the hierarchy on one side, but then you have the accelerator on the other side. And this is where you get your volunteer army, because there are faculty who are on the traditional side who want to go do some innovative things, but they can't innovate in their space. So one of the things I would encourage the CE community to do is create that space and invite those pioneers and change agents into it. But again, like Tom alluded to, it has to have high up buy-in. And that would be the question I would have, you know, that they could raise to their leadership is, where's our space to fail? And where's our space to try? And you're going to find in most cases it will be the CE space.
I just want to jump in on something Rob said, because we have this conversation all the time over the last year, that the non-credit space can really be the beta tester, right, of future courses and programs for credit, because credit programming, if you look at historically, does not have the best financial record in the world in post-secondary. It takes a long time to set up. I still remember talking to a few industry people about setting up a new IT degree, that they said, by the time you finish setting it up, the first 3 years will be useless. Yeah. So why even bother? I mean, it was startling, but very realistic, because things are moving so quickly. I mean, that's where the CE space can actually be that accelerator for the institute.
Absolutely. Actually, it's interesting. I don't think we'll have time to dive into the full pedagogical scope, but we did get a question about the idea of where competency-based education fits into this conversation.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's there. You know, I'm so sorry we don't have time. We'll try to get deeper into it at the end, but I'd say where competency-based education comes in is just in our capacity to actually meet student expectations, meet employer engagement and their expectations as we're pursuing the delivery of high quality learning. Now, we're going to come back to a poll. And I'm very excited to see the results of this poll. We'll give you a little bit longer with it, maybe 45 seconds for this one. What role should your institutional website play in engaging modern learners? Are we talking about a leading role where the website deeply engages students and facilitates their registration? Are we talking about a secondary role where the website should inform students and provide information on their registration, or a lagging role where the website just isn't that much of a priority when it comes to student engagement? There's a lot to think through here. We're not just talking about continuing ed in this instance. We're talking about the root of your digital engagement. We'll give it another 10 seconds or so. Or maybe 5. 10 seconds is a lot longer when you're living it. So let's see the results. Wow. Guys, you're not going to believe this. So Linda, can please keep the result of the poll up here for 1 second, because 73% of respondents here said that the website should deeply engage students and facilitate their registration, which is exactly, I feel, oh, I should have put money on that. That's amazing. 73% of respondents in this webinar and 73% of respondents to our survey said that the institutional website should play a leading role in deeply engaging students and driving their registrations. Now, here's what's crazy. We can take the poll off the screen now. Only 10% of respondents rated their websites as very effective at driving that engagement, enrollment, and retention. And it's incredible to me. This is really incredible to me, because what it points out is that we have a broad recognition of what we need to do to engage a modern learner. We have a broad recognition of our role as customer service agencies to some extent when it comes to delivering on the expectations of all students that we serve, whether they're credit, non-credit, whether they're adults, whether they're teenagers, whether they're the parents of an 8-year-old trying to register them for a summer camp. So let's start off with the basics. What role does the digital environment play in customer engagement for modern students? And we'll start off with Rob, please.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite ones. My background is in marketing and enrollment, so it's near and dear to my heart. But I like to tell people, and the way I would always express this to our teams, is that your website is the university. When people aren't on campus, especially even if they are sometimes, it is the university. What is true on the website is what is true about your university. And that also includes the experience. And so people, I've got this book on my shelf on web design from many, many years ago. I never read it. And the reason why is the cover says it all. Don't make me think. When you get to most websites, what ends up happening is I got to figure out what I'm supposed to do, because this website didn't anticipate that I was coming and wanted to do what I wanted to do. That experience gets shut down super fast, and then they go on to another experience until they find what they're looking for. And I think you see the institutions that have really been thriving and growing, they understand this implicitly. And so, we had a conversation about this, that you don't have one website. So back years ago, there's all these battles about who owns the website, and there's all these compromises made at universities. And the truth is, when you look at your numbers, and I'm sure Tom's done a lot of research on this at his institution, you see that there's a lot of entry points for people. And you really need to look at how many home pages do you actually have for the constituents you serve. It's super critical. And getting that job done that they came to do on your website, that's how everything should be designed around those jobs to be done. And in a lot of times, people aren't even thinking about the jobs to be done. They're thinking about, it's actually, they're not thinking about the customer at all. It's an internal battle, right? And people are debating on photos and fonts and who's going to write the copy and who has access to edit it. And it's like, none of that matters, right? The customer is not caring about that. So this one is huge. And of course, then you go into the systems behind it. Once they get into the system, get what they want done, what happens afterward? How long does it take for something to happen the job to get done? So a lot could be said. We talked about this before, we could do a whole webinar just on this one question, but I'll let Tom step in and add his 2 cents to it.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think you said it all, so I'm not sure what else I'm going to say. But no, I completely agree. I mean, this whole idea, too many times we use our websites to push information at people. Right? I mean, I've had this conversation with our marketing and comms group for too long. I'm saying this isn't about us. Right? We need to design this based on what our customers are looking for. Right? And one of the areas that we're looking at right now is our whole content management system, right? For your website, about who can put up content when, because sometimes you want to put up content and people say, well, it's going to take us 2 weeks to do it, or 2 months. So I was going, well, that's 2 weeks too late, because I need it for tomorrow, because my customers are going to be looking for the ad that I'm putting up, right, in 24 hours from now. Like just that agility side is absolutely, I find, still a struggle in post-secondary. We very much want to make it, Well, make sure that it looks like the institution. And I don't disagree, right? But make it usable for the customer. You can have both. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be one or the other. I'm just going to interject really quickly with a cautionary tale about not thinking about your customer first. So we brought in a new ERP 2 years ago, and anybody who's brought in an ERP knows root canals are probably more enjoyable. They're behemoths. You're spending millions of dollars, and our registration system that was put in, nobody looked at it from a non-credit lens at all. Right? It was horrific. It was basically asking you for basically credit amount of information. Whereas you're non-credit, I just want to buy something from you. That's it. We lost a lot of customers during that time period. We don't even know how many. But we, at that point, and I'll say it was myself who made the decision, we need a completely separate SIS system that's only focused on non-credit and run it like that. And of course, for us, we and Amrit knows this, we chose Destiny as our product because it's very intuitive, right? So the analytics that I can now get from my customer base, from the moment they come into the site to the time they left, whether they bought or not, I can actually start tracking every single one of them and truly understanding what products are interesting, what are they looking for that we don't have. So it just completely changes the whole idea of being responsive and agile as you go forward.
Very good.
100%, because foundationally, I mean, you guys are using terms that are, I guess, more common in executive boardrooms, right? We're talking about customer journeys. We're talking about some level of understanding pathways that a customer might take, and making sure that their digital experience, their digital engagement is actually tailored for the jobs to be done that they're coming to you for, right? Because when we think about the website as a glorified message board, it's not really putting people in a position to achieve their jobs to be done. It's really putting them in a position to understand that the institution has great research and an athletics program. But that information is only interesting to certain people at certain points. So let's talk about that idea of personalization. I mean, how important is that delivery of a personalized experience to transforming a learner's engagement with the institution to something that's more akin to what they'd see on Amazon? And Tom, let's start with you here.
Well, I throw back as a question: who does not want that anymore? Yeah, I mean, seriously. I mean, when I don't get it, and I'll tell you, I get turned off very quickly from an organization. Going, you haven't put a lot of thought into the customer experience side on this. You're just throwing content at me. I can get content anywhere. I don't need to go to your website to get that. I can Google it if I want to. So personalization, I think, is huge, Amrit, and it's only going to get, I think, larger. And for us, one of the areas that we're looking at is actually using our career. I talked to you about the software that shows different jobs available, et cetera. Well, actually having your potential customer come onto your site and say, you know what, I want to be a senior data analytics manager. They type it in. Would actually be able to show all the different careers that are available in the region, what skills that they would need, and what courses the institution offers in order to meet that. That's personalization. Now you're taking it to the level that your actual customer is looking for and going, so don't just throw a bunch of website pages at me, actually customize it to because they're coming for a problem. They all have some sort of a problem, right? And and it might be where they're looking for a new position, they're looking for a program, but how do you tailor it then to basically look at what they are truly looking for as they're going through your website?
Rob?
I would only add to that, the point that Tom made is that it's not just students who are expecting personalization, it's also faculty and staff. And they're equally frustrated with the website. They can't easily get the information that they need. They can't easily track their students or even their own activities the way that they need them tracked. And this reminds me when Amazon came and started personalizing our shopping experiences. I mean, they've dematerialized storefronts. Think of, so you got the iPhone, it dematerialized like hundreds of tools and put them into a phone. And then it's the same thing with Amazon. They dematerialize storefronts. And so when you look at the web, you say, well, what needs to be dematerialized in education? how many schools still have forms? You have to walk somewhere and actually have somebody sign something. You know, it's just crazy, but I find it's not as hard of a sell when you just ask somebody, well, what do you expect? And kind of to Tom's point, another key piece of this is that as you start building your data, and of course with Tom's school, they've got so much information. With machine learning, pretty soon you're going to be serving up options and say, students like you tended to do this and had outcomes like, you know, X. And that's going to help them guide themselves to a successful outcome. And it actually is going to cost you less money to provide that outcome because they're able to self-service. And so, yeah, it's super, super critical.
Amber, I just want to jump in on one thing that Rob hit, which I think is absolutely imperative. When we talk about the website, you can't talk about a website in isolation. Is the whole service journey after that going to be a good one for them? Because you can actually set yourself up for failure where you have this great website, and then after that, the applicant gets ground down by the institutional processes. So that is something that we are looking at a lot, is that whole idea of automation, right? Because automation will lead to self-service. And you know, I always rail when I see, because one of my favorite things to do is go down to the office of the registrar on the first day of classes and watch the lineup, right? And I asked our leadership, I said, why are they lining up? I said, do you think they're lining up because they want to line up, or are they lining up because we made them line up? And 95% of the time, yeah, it's the latter. There's no value added to the student, none. We're just forcing them to do all these different things. So you really do have to, if you're going to talk about a customer journey map, you've got to look at the whole map, right? Yeah. And really look at all of your processes all the way through, right? Because that's where you build your brand as you go.
I mean, I think Tom is right on. In our previous, you talked about ERPs and your ERP transition you went through recently. At one of my previous institutions, I would ask people a question: who is our system designed for? Yeah, you know, to use like an Edwards Deming question, because it's producing that result. Whatever it's designed to produce, it produces it super efficiently. But the answer to the question was no one. I was never going to find the person it was designed for. And in a customer-centric environment like we're in, you need to start with the customer and the system needs to be built around. That's what Amazon did. That is different than higher ed. Higher ed starts with people, processes, and structures, and then it sprinkles technology on it to where the people are part of the technology. Like you may be in a situation where it's like, wow, this thing's not working. So-and-so's on vacation and we can't do it until so-and-so gets back. It's like, that doesn't work very well, right? Because like if you look at the statistics on Gen Z, for example, they expect 24/7 access and self-service. But to Tom's point, so do we, right? I don't want to talk to somebody when I book a trip. I just want to book my trip and then I want to cancel it and not talk to somebody, right? It's the same with education.
Absolutely. I mean, the more we do to recognize that we're serving customers, because here's the thing, and I want to take a pause here to talk about the idea of customer service and customer experience, because I think we tend to get really caught up in that wording and kind of we immediately default to the customer is always right. And that's not what this means. No. What customer service means in higher education is getting rid of those unnecessary roadblocks and unnecessary obstacles that stand between someone and the objective they're trying to achieve, which is the opportunity to learn something, right? And the more complicated we make everything outside of the learning experience, the less likely they are to enroll, to persist, to complete, and to come back, right? And both Rob and Tom have talked about this idea of, you know, how do we simplify the lifelong learning journey? How do we encourage people to take related programming? How do we create opportunities for folks to continue their education? Because that's the point of our industry. It's not to turn a profit for shareholders. What we're trying to do is create opportunities for folks to recognize the value of enriching themselves and continuing their learning and creating this kind of lifelong journey towards the outcomes that they set for themselves. Which brings me to the last stat that we were going to discuss today before we get into the Q&A. And this kind of comes back to the idea Tom was just talking about. They ripped out the main campus ERP, replaced it with a different ERP designed specifically for the traditional student, and wound up having to bring in a totally different SIS because they wanted to tailor that experience. And I think that's extremely common. Rob, to your point, I'm concerned by the idea of an entire tech infrastructure that's designed for the learner that the institution is serving. Because I think any given institution probably serves 40 to 50 different kinds of learners. So I almost think it's a matter of how do you create an infrastructure that's integratable, so that you can create the right level of point solution to make sure that you're serving your audiences, but not at such a discrete level that you have a different system for every student.
Yeah,
You know, but how do you create that kind of like well-rounded tech environment where you're able to deliver the broad space and the broad need?
well, you know, one of the challenges in higher education is the silo effect of higher education. Things are built in silos, and this happens also to data structures, right? You have all these people who manage certain aspects of data, but they don't care that that data matters to somebody else. So maybe they don't always capture certain information that's just maybe not relevant to them. The problem with data, of course, is that it's all relevant at some point. You just don't know when it's going to be relevant to you, right? And we find that out. I mean, I've overseen institutional research, and you know, they are always changing the rules of what you need to report, and then you go back and go, oh gosh, well, we weren't capturing that. We captured about 65% of that. Well, is that enough? Usually not. If you're going to make program decisions, is 80% data accuracy enough to shut down a program? Well, probably not for the people whose program is under consideration. So when you're building systems, you want to anticipate what the needs are that the system is addressing. And if one of the needs are, we're going to have people from K through 80 years old in this system at some point. So what are those, how do we anticipate what the system needs might be for that? Or we're going to co-create with organizations. How do they seamlessly interact with us online? How do we pass data to each other online? You know, it's actually thinking through who are the users, right? And to your point, it's not just one user. You're not just gonna have one customer. You're gonna have lots and lots of customers, and then you're gonna have lots of service providers. And I would argue you're gonna have lots of partners going forward. Yeah. We're not gonna have fewer partners in the future. We're gonna have lots more partners in the future. So your systems have to be built around that. And you know, kind of a point Tom made, you should be able to redesign your entire website every year if you need to. But part of the systems that also have to be adjusted is the governance systems, because sometimes it has nothing to do with technological limitation. It has to do with governance limitation. That's the thing that really, really needs to change. Once you can change that, it's surprising what you can accomplish when the human roadblocks are dealt with. So it's really anticipating all of that. And how do you create a structure that anticipates agility? You know, like I like what Tom was saying. He was like, well, we can't be agile in this environment, so we're going to create another environment that allows us to be agile. I love that. I think that's smart.
For sure. And I think it kind of brings us to this kind of concept here, which is, you know, folks have had an opportunity to look at this chart. 60% of respondents to our survey said that in order for them to deliver that high quality customer experience that non-traditional students are looking for, took significant staff effort. And a further 10% said they didn't have the capacity to deliver that experience at all. You know, and it kind of gets to, I guess, this concept of high touch, high tech, right? Like how do we deliver a customer-centric student experience when we don't have operational effectiveness? So Tom, you've recently experienced this shift. How does operational effectiveness play into the delivery of a customer-centric student experience?
It's huge, Everett. I have to tell you, when we went to print in our new SIS, the first thing I asked is, how long will this take? And I was told 2 years. I won't tell you what I said back, right? We spun it up in under 4 months, right? Because I said, this is all about our customer. I said, the sense of urgency has to be there. And instead of doing this traditional sort of waterfall setup, we actually tried an agile system setup, which we've never done at the Institute before, because I was always very methodical. And I'll tell you, it was a great success, and will be the model now going forward because we've proven that we can actually do it. I really like what Rob said about the whole idea of silos. So we actually have just spun up our whole governance model for IT, because that's exactly what's happening. People would just buy software, right, and say, and the funny part is you'd have 3 or 4 groups who bought the same software from the same vendor, right? So we're finally getting our arms around this whole, because we probably have 1,000+ pieces of software, right, at our institute at least, right, with all the different programs. So I think it's really important, right, that and again, to something that Rob said that I think is really important, you have to do it all yourself. People, I find post-secondaries can be sometimes very insulated, right? Whereas, there's probably other organizations that can do what you're thinking about doing, probably much better and much faster and probably less expensive than you doing it. We are really pushing hard on cloud computing, right? And partners in our cloud computing, because one of the things that you have to be careful about is when you have everything internal, cybersecurity becomes a much bigger deal. There's been several post-secondaries in Canada, as you know, Emma, that have got hit, and it was all from their internal servers. It had nothing to do with cloud computing. So cybersecurity is becoming a very, very big deal as well. The last point I'm going to make is what Rob brought up about data. It's something that we are talking about a lot, because everybody has their own chunks of data, but we're not integrating it. So you can talk AI, right, or big data, machine learning, all you want. If you don't have any data, right, that's actually proper, everything else, you just spent a lot of money for nothing. So, right now in my group, we had 5 different systems for different parts of our non-credit that we're doing a master data management program where we're actually integrating all systems. Integration isn't as hard as it used to be. I think people still think that it's a magical thing. It's not anymore. The technology has kept pace where we can actually start so that, you have that one, we always call it one source of truth. If you need to go grab data, you just go to this system and you pull it out, knowing that data has integrity to it is huge, because that drives a lot of decision making for us as well.
100%. I have to be mindful of the time, and we have been getting a number of questions. So Rob, if you're comfortable, would you be open to us moving to the Q&A from here, guys?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And do again, feel free to use the Q&A tab at the top, because we are getting some great questions in, and I want to make sure we do leave time for that. Before we get there, obviously we're firm believers in high quality digital engagement being central to higher education's future. So if this is a topic you're interested in learning more about, please do register for a web event that we're hosting next Tuesday on March 30th that's focused on this idea of massive personalization and career pathways. Visit moderncampus.com/new standard. That's capital NU, capital S standard. To register for that. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. You can also check out our resource center to access other white papers and think pieces that we've been developing that explore different facets of this conversation, including a white paper on how a modern e-commerce experience can support institutional revenue growth. Now, I want to address a question that we got relatively early on in our talk today, around that concept of micro-credentials. And Rob, you mentioned micro-credentials. Tom, you mentioned micro-credentials. I mentioned about 80% of our survey respondents said that they plan to add or grow to their stock, their portfolio of micro-credentials over the coming years. We got a question about 10 years ago, the common wisdom that MOOCs were the future. How certain are we about micro-credentials being the future of higher ed? Now, I'd like to get us rolling here by pointing out that I think they're two different things. I think MOOCs were a new approach to doing program delivery, whereas micro-credentials offer us a more lifelong learning friendly approach to managing programming and organizing programming. Rob, do you want to maybe kick us off on this one?
You bet. So first of all, sort of using MOOCs as a whipping post is wrong, because MOOCs were wildly successful. So let's just clarify that. It's actually, MOOCs are 10 years old. The first MOOC was at Stanford in 2011, right? Artificial intelligence. They had 160,000 people take that course and 20,000 finished it. Now, look at Coursera. Who is the biggest provider of online education in the entire world? It's Coursera. They have like 78 million active users. They are not even 10 years old, right? 2012 is when they came into existence. So we got to put all that stuff into perspective. When we think about micro-credentials, here's one thing that we're working on at Lindenwood, is every company of any size, medium to large companies, they have their own academies inside of these companies. These academies are designed to upskill their employees, right? What these organizations are realizing is that they're not in the education business. But the rate of change, I mean, I've talked to Intel. I was at Intel a year and a half ago when I was back in Oregon, talking to their HR leader about this very issue. They can't get skills fast enough for their needs, but they also don't want to take on the burden of education. That's why micro-credentials are so huge. It's because it's just-in-time learning in a world that is rapid. It's changing faster than at any time in human history. If you look at adoption rates, look at the adoption rate of the iPhone compared to the personal computer, right? It's like, I want to say it was less than 3 years. You had a quarter of the population had a smartphone, and it took 16 years for a quarter of the population to get a computer, and 50 years, I think, for like a telephone. So you look at how AI and automation are disrupting the workforce. It's huge. So micro-credentials they didn't emerge because somebody had this esoteric idea to do this. They emerged because there's an actual real need for it. It's the same for MOOCs. Why did MOOCs emerge? Because somebody realized that you could take some really smart people, instead of them just teaching like 25 people, they could teach 250,000 people. That is a genius idea, right? And now that with YouTube, you have people arguing you might not need to go to college for certain things, because you can learn from some of the best in the world, from some of the best universities on your own time. So micro-credentials definitely have a place, but I think people need to understand they come from a place of need, not from some place of, I have this really cool idea and it's really, I'm really passionate about it. So I think you need to take micro-credentials very seriously. And if you want an example, again, going back to SNU, who doesn't need more students, right? Southern New Hampshire is like one of the world's largest institutions, has grown faster than anybody. What did they just do? You would think that they could take on micro-credentials themselves, right, with their technological infrastructure. They were like, no, we think we need to acquire somebody to get. So when you look at the innovative players, what are they doing? They're going into this space because they see it. They're not going into the space because they think it's cool or neat. They're going into it because they say, this is part of the future. And so that's kind of how we perceive it as well.
Absolutely. I'll tell you what as well, there's a question that we did get that, Tom, I'm going to throw your way, because I think it's really interesting. And it's about the idea that Rob raised, actually, about, thinking about the educational engagement like booking a trip. And the comment is there a place for face-to-face involvement at all? I think it's a little harsh to liken an educational experience to booking and canceling a trip. And I do think that's true, but Rob, not to put words in your mouth, I believe what you were talking about is sort of the administrative experience that surrounds the engagement. And it gets to the idea of high touch, high tech in terms of, how are folks using their time? So Tom, very quickly to close out, how important is high touch, high tech to the future of post-secondary institutions when it comes to closing that modern learner engagement gap?
Well, and I think Rob nailed it with the idea that if people want to do self-service, they want to be able to do self-service, right? There are a lot of people who want to have that human touch still. There's no question about it. I think the point was that you actually have the service models based on what your customer is looking for, right? As opposed to saying, well, this is the only way you can come through our door, right? Is, you got to walk up to our campus, you got to go to our registrar. People just won't do it anymore, right? People want flexibility, right? They want choice. They don't want to fit into the model of the process that you created, which could be 50, 60 years old now. And that convenience side, that personalization side is absolutely critical, I think, moving forward for post-secondary.
Absolutely. Guys, it has been a privilege doing this web event with you both. Thank you so much for joining me. to the folks that attended. We really hope you enjoyed the conversation. It's certainly, this is a passion area of ours. If you're interested again in learning more about closing the modern learner engagement gap, please do visit moderncampus.com/new standard. Thank you all for attending. It's really been a joy.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.